Going good. All right, excellent. Hello, everyone. Hope you had a good weekend. What we're going to do today is we're going to finish up talking about appeals to authority. We'll probably go pretty just straight into group activity. I'm going to give you, we have 4 questions on the group activity for today. I'm going to give you about 25 minutes or so for it. And then we'll come back together after that time and finish up the rest of chapter 6. We're running. I did some sort of stock of where we are in the semester. We're running a little bit behind of where I was planning on us being, but that's entirely to be expected. Everything's taking a little bit longer doing in this online format, so we probably won't get done everything that I was originally hoping to, but we should at least get through all the important material that we need to get done before the final exam. So we should at least be good there. We're probably just going to have to not be able to really talk about conspiracy theories, or not be able to talk about them for very long at the very least. So that'll be the unfortunate loss caused by our switch to this online format. Someone's asking if we'll have a group activity on Wednesday. Probably, but it depends a little bit on some timing issues. One is going to at least be ready and available to go on Wednesday, but we might not have enough time, depending on how long we spend talking about the next topic for Wednesday. We might not have time to actually get to it until Friday. So I'm not sure yet. It'll depend a little bit about how long it takes us to go through statistical syllogisms on Wednesday. So one brief note I wanted to make before I send you groups. I just wanted to go over the last assignment with you all real fast. All 3 of the ones you were looking at last time are pretty bad. They're probably all examples that we should reject outright. In the case of this number 1, there's 2 different problems, both of which are probably severe enough to reject the appeal to authority individually, and so collectively they're definitely enough. We have, first of all, Michael Jordan is indeed an excellent athlete. Indeed, he would be an expert in athletic questions, but he's not particularly a relevant authority on nutritional topics, like what breakfast cereal is nutritionally relevant. So he really isn't an authority in any of the relevant fields. He also has an enormous conflict of interest. This is a commercial. He is literally being paid to say what it is that he's saying. He's not saying it particularly because of any independent expertise. He's saying it just because he's being paid to say it. And that just isn't good enough. That's not good enough to count as a relevant appeal to authority. In the second case, we're violating the second criteria here. And indeed, we're doing more than just violating it. So there actually is a consensus in the field, and this scientist is rejecting that consensus. That's enough, again, to just commit the fallacy, right, by itself. Not enough to, we don't just need to reject, not just need to be more suspicious, we need to actually reject it. And I'm going to talk about this example a little bit more in a second. And then the third one, I think almost everyone did really well with this third one. This doesn't seem to be a domain where we think appeals to authority are particularly relevant, where simply a domain that we think the kind of expertise exists such that you just take people's word for things. It's important to remember with these appeals to authority that what we're actually doing, the way the argument works is that the argument is saying, take my word for it, right? It's a weird kind of argument. It almost is an argument that's not giving an argument at all, right? Because the only real claim is just, trust me, take my word for it, trust what I'm saying. So I want to talk about a little bit, because particularly with the number 2, a lot of people were saying on that second problem that we should be more suspicious but not reject the claim that the scientist is making. And I agree with you, we shouldn't reject the scientist's claim, but we should still reject the appeal to authority. So when you reject an appeal to authority, if you say it's committing the fallacy, you aren't saying that we shouldn't listen to the claim, we shouldn't listen to the person making the argument. It's not an ad hominem fallacy. What you're saying is that we shouldn't just take the speaker's word for it that he or she is correct. So simply because in the case of number 2, the person is a scientist, we shouldn't just take their word for it, because most other relevant scientists in the field disagree with their conclusion. Now, other scientists should indeed take seriously any publications that this scientist presents, right? And maybe the theoretical consensus will change as a result of the efforts of this scientist. But until that happens, we can't just take this one scientist's word for it. Here's a way of thinking about it. If you're saying that an appeal to authority is at all reliable, that there's anything good about it, you're saying that we should believe that the conclusion is true. But in this case, you have way more evidence that the conclusion is false than the conclusion is true, right? Most of the experts are going to say that the conclusion is false. So if you were just weighing it numerically almost, you have way more evidence, way more relevant experts saying that the conclusion is false than that the conclusion is true. So you have no good reason then to believe that the conclusion is true based on the appeal to authority that's getting made in the argument. So that was the only thing I really saw from the last set. Any questions about any of that before we go into today's group work? All right. So just a quick note: today's the ones in today's group work are going to tend to be a little bit more nuanced. All three of those were from last time were pretty obviously problematic. In this case, be a little bit more nuanced. At least many of them will have a little bit more nuance to it. So I'm going to send you into your groups now. We'll have about 25 minutes, and then we'll come back after 25 minutes to finish up talking about chapter 6. So let me add the link. All right, I think everyone should be back. All right, excellent. So yeah, I'll get those graded, and we'll talk about them specifically maybe beginning of next class. Go over anything we need to go over there. What I'd like to do now for the remainder of our class time is go through the last little part of chapter 6. So we've been talking about these appeal to authority arguments, right? Arguments that are basically of the form, trust me, I'm an expert. What makes it more complicated than that, for the most part, is that by and large, we're not actually getting stuff from experts. I mean, when was the last time, you heard something about vaccine safety from someone purporting to be an expert in the field? Conversely, when was the last time you heard something about vaccines safety from some random crazy person on Facebook that you may or may not be friends with or family with or something, right? And the person talking on Facebook, they're not claiming they themselves are the expert. They're claiming what they've heard from people, right? Sort of what we're going to call sort of a secondhand report. Almost everything we get is kind of secondhand. And then, so it's going to make it even more complicated to sort of analyze these appeals to authority. Because let's say, here's an example of a secondhand report source, the news. News media is entirely secondhand. The people writing a reporter writing an article isn't an expert in the field. The reporter is reporting what it is that experts in the field have said. So it's even more complicated now, right? We have an even more complicated chain of transmission. We have to analyze who was the expert in the first place, and then is this secondhand reporter doing a good job sort of transmitting this information to us? It's a horrible game of telephone or whatever, right? Where the worry is that the message is going to get more and more mangled with time. From some of my friends who work in the biological sciences, they always express incredible frustration with how the result of their research gets reported in popular news media sources, because the people reporting on the results are not themselves experts. They themselves are not scientists, and that they're reporting on what it is that the experts have sort of reported, what it is that the experts have said. So what I want to just end talking about with 15 minutes or so, we'll go quick with it. How can we sort of handle this situation, this sort of secondhand report situation? Because this is what we normally encounter, right? I was talking to someone after class yesterday about they were sort of ran into a person at the grocery store, and the person at the grocery store was sort of talking about what to do about the coronavirus or whatever, right? But that person's not claiming to be an expert. They're saying what they've heard that experts have said. An even more complicated thing to analyze or to evaluate. So let's talk a little bit just about how to deal with these sort of secondhand reports. So some examples of kinds of things I'm talking about, again, news report, YouTube videos, right? Things we hear from friends or family, right? Evaluating these secondhand points are going to be very similar. These criteria should all sound familiar. They're all going to sort of resemble the criteria for analyzing appeals to authority just in general. But it's going to be even harder in a lot of cases to actually really evaluate how seriously to take a secondhand report. And I sort of made this claim earlier, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more today, hopefully, right? I think this sort of fake news crisis that people talk a lot about is really an expertise crisis or authority crisis. We don't know who to trust as authorities in the primary sense, and we certainly don't know who to trust as sort of secondhand sources of what it is that the authorities themselves are actually reporting. So here are some things to look at, right? So let's say you're watching a news report, or you're seeing something that you see on Facebook or a website, something of that sort. All right. Is the domain that's being reported on an appropriate domain of expertise? Right. Someone reporting about, again, moral matters, or moral matters don't seem to be things that admit of expertise. Yeah, we should therefore, that's probably not going to be a trustworthy secondhand report of what it is that the experts actually say, because we don't think there are moral experts. Second criteria is where things get a little bit more interesting. These secondhand sources, they themselves are not experts, right? They are reporters of experts. But you need to understand what you're reporting on well enough. You need to be a competent enough authority in that field to accurately report what it is that the actual experts are saying. And this is the problem that some of those scientist friends that were sort of complaining about. They thought that my scientist friends thought that their research was sort of proving a sort of mild conclusion, like there's a slight correlation between taking a certain iron supplement and being at a greater risk for a particular sort of colon cancer if you had a lot of other warning signs. And then this gets reported at supplement causes cancer. And the scientists said that's a gross oversimplification. That's not what we said. We didn't say this supplement caused cancer. We said that it could increase your risk of it if certain other factors are also present, right? And if you don't have the author being themselves at least competent, not necessarily an expert, but at least competent enough in the field, they're going to just mistranslate. It'll be a bad game of telephone. They're just going to mistranslate what it is that the experts are actually saying. So it's sort of a weird balancing act there, though, right? Because we can't expect reporters of information to themselves be experts. That's too high of a bar. How expert do they need to be? That's where it gets tricky. That's where the sort of art of logic rather than the science of logic comes in. You're going to have to just sort of evaluate, I guess, how much competency is sort of needed. So any questions on either of those first two criteria? Good so far. All right, let's move on to the third one then. This third one is probably the most important. Is the reporter, whoever it is, trying to minimize the effects of his or her bias on the report? Are there conflicts of interest with the sort? What is the person selling? And more generally speaking, why does this report even exist at all? So let's just pause for a second before we even just talk about this as sort of criteria. I see a lot of time people making a really good claim and then following up the really good claim with something deeply problematic. So I frequently hear people say, I don't trust this source of information, whatever it is, doesn't matter, right? Because I am legitimately, perhaps, concerned that this source of information is in some sense biased, or that it's trying to sell me something, or that because of, for example, the way capitalist economics work, that it needs to sensationalize the news in order to sell it better to people. And so I am justifiably perhaps suspicious of this source of information. And that's perfectly fair. There's all kinds of reasons to be suspicious of conflicts of interest and biases in the case of these secondhand sources. But people frequently will follow that claim up with, so therefore I'm going to believe this random YouTube video that I saw. Right? Like, I'm not going to trust the news media. Instead, I'm only going to trust random things that I see on YouTube. But all of those same concerns exist on the random thing that you see on YouTube, right? Who's the author of that? What's their competency? How are they selling the video? Because they too need to sell the video. What are their biases? How are their biases at play? if we're going to be concerned about this sort of question of sort of bias and conflict of interest, and we should be, we need to be concerned with it in a very generalized sense. This is not a problem that only affects certain kinds of media. It's a general problem. It's a problem that all of these sort of secondhand reports are going to need to be checked for. So we're just going to have to be aware and almost just constantly asking the question, why is someone telling me this? What are they going to get out of it? Frequently, you will have people purposefully and deliberately giving out bad information because they have a financial stake in doing so, right? Don't trust vaccines, trust this random bit of snake oil that I'm selling, right? And of course, I'm not going to tell you that I'm selling it, right? There's, by the way, though, just follow this link and you'll get to my store, right? Be wary of it sort of in every direction, right? And again, the same kinds of things with the appeal to authority relevant. How good is the source being at revealing its conflicts of interests? That's a sign that they're taking it seriously, right? How aware does the source seem to be that they have a bias? Because everyone has biases again, right? You can't be impartial, you can't not have biases. But how aware is this secondary report aware of its biases and trying to do it as best as possible, at least critically engage with them? So someone's asking me to go back to the notes for a second. Absolutely. So you'll hear for a second. And how are we feeling with this sort of third thing, right? I mean, I'm not really going to give you all questions on an exam about analyzing these secondhand sources. We're more just talking about today about stuff that I think it's actually important just to be aware of, stuff to sort of to be a critical consumer of information, if you want to use that kind of language, things to be aware of in terms of how to be a critical sort of a reviewer of information, a critical consumer of it. So how are people feeling with this third criteria? Does anyone have any questions or thoughts or comments before we move on at all? All right, good. So let's move on to the fourth one. All right. One great thing about the internet actually helps with this in a lot of ways. It lets us actually link back to the original primary sources. And that's what in general, particularly since everything is online now, that's what you should sort of be expecting, right? With all of these sort of secondhand sources, it's now so easy for them to link back to the original primary source, the source that was actually originally from the experts. You should expect that. Again, not when you're talking to people. That's not a possibility in spoken interactions, at least. But on something like Facebook or on something like a news article, right? You should expect links to the primary sources because it's so easy to do on the internet. You should expect it, and then maybe if it's an important topic, follow the link. Actually see, hey, how good is this primary source, right? If this primary source is just a guy's snake oil website trying to sell you something, yeah, it's not that great of a source, right? Follow the links back, and preferably, if it's a field that admits for it, the links should be to something peer-reviewed. Right? Peer-reviewed sources are just always preferable to non-peer-reviewed sources, even though peer review is not itself perfect. But you have a far higher degree of confidence in something that's been peer-reviewed than something that's not. Now, one worry with following these sort of hyperlink cases is that frequently you're not going to be able to read the primary source, particularly if it's a science article, but even in other fields as well, right? But academic articles at least always have what's called an abstract. And an abstract is basically where the author just gives a really quick sort of summary of the big picture conclusions of their result. So maybe you won't be able to get to the actual article itself, or maybe you won't be able to understand the article itself, but you can at least go back to the abstract of a peer-reviewed primary source document. And that will give you a good sense of, is this sort of secondary source relying on the right primary sources and getting those primary sources correct? Surprisingly, you know what's actually a remarkably good source? Wikipedia. It's surprisingly good. Everyone was really concerned when Wikipedia first came out, because I'm old enough that I actually remember Wikipedia first coming out and how scared academics were of it. But actually, Wikipedia has turned into a great source because of this ability to link to things. You can actually follow the links. You can actually follow the evidence trail and see what were the original sources. And indeed, the sort of peer moderators on Wikipedia articles, that's what they do. When someone makes an edit, someone goes back in, follows the link, follows the sources, because you have to source stuff on Wikipedia, right? And makes sure that the source that's being cited is a legitimate one, right? Is a worthwhile or valid one. So Wikipedia actually turns out to be a pretty good secondary source. It's not a primary source, but it's at the very least a pretty good way of finding primary sources, right? Finding what it is that the experts actually themselves say, even though it itself is not expert testimony. How are we doing there? Any questions or thoughts about this sort of fourth thing to be aware of? All right, one last one then, and then we'll end it up for the day. Last thing, and again, this is one we have to be really worried about, just like with the appeals to authority arguments, just in general, right? The reporter should be able to give some kind of plausible report of what arguments the experts were using in the course of reaching the conclusions that they reached. But we have to be really, really cautious here. There is a lot of plausible sounding nonsense, right? Just a lot of stuff that sounds really good and has no evidence behind it whatsoever, right? The paleo diet, right? Like it's this claim that we should eat what our primitive ancestors ate, and our primitive ancestors didn't eat like processed gluten products, so we should avoid processed gluten products. And this is for evolutionary reasons, right? Because we haven't changed that much. We're evolutionarily close to those primitive ancestors, and so things that our primitive ancestors didn't eat, we shouldn't eat. That all maybe sounds plausible and all sounds reasonable enough, and if you're not an expert, yeah, sure, it sounds plausible enough. The problem is, from biologists that I have talked to, it's all nonsense. Like it's getting evolution wrong. It's actually getting what we ate in the past wrong. It's actually mischaracterizing what people actually seem to have eaten in the past, as far as we can tell, right? So the mere fact that something sounds plausible, that's not enough, but the report should at least include something that is plausible. Right. So this is more something that the reporter should be able to do, rather than something that sort of verifies that they are in fact an expert themselves. And like I said, I'm not really going to give you so many problems where I ask you to sort of analyze these secondhand sources. What I'm more interested here in is just in all of us being better at sort of critically consuming this information, almost just knowing the right questions to ask. Because this can show up in all kinds of really important subjects, right? Reports on science articles is one thing, but this also shows up on important political questions too, right? And there, all the more so, we've got various sorts of concerns about biases, various concerns about conflicts of interest, right? And so almost all I'm hoping that we can do today, because we had like 20 minutes to go over all this stuff, right? So in the short time we had, all I'm hoping that we can sort of take from this is the need to ask these kinds of questions about the media we consume. Okay. Raise the question, why does this thing exist? What is it trying to sell me? Raise the question, what biases does this have? But what biases do that other thing that I read have too? Right? And how problematic are they? Did people know that they have these biases? Right? Is the person who's saying this competent to report on this information in the way that they are? Right? So this sort of task of being a critical information consumer, that's, I guess, the big thing that I'm hoping we take away from this sort of whole of chapter 6, right? What are the questions we need to ask of the authorities that we need to rely upon? Because we don't have a choice. We can't all be experts in everything. It's not possible. All right. I think that's the end of what I wanted us to go over in chapter 6. What we'll start on Wednesday is what are called statistical syllogisms. So we've been talking about probative inductive arguments up to this point. We're going to talk about statistical inductive arguments for about a week or so coming up. So we'll start with what are called statistical syllogisms. We're not going to be actually using the textbook for this. I'm going to send you a PDF from another textbook. Statistical syllogisms aren't that hard, so my hope is that we'll go over all of them on Wednesday, including doing a group activity. We might not have enough time, at which point I'll push the group activity to Friday. So that is the plan going forward. Thank you all very much. Let me stop the video.